A woman was found dead in her apartment under strange and unsettling circumstances. At first, detectives thought the answer was right on the surface. But as the case unfolded, it turned into a 15-year mystery, full of twists, dead ends, and unanswered questions. And in the end, it all came down to one random twist of fate that finally revealed the truth. Pamela Chrysler was born on March 16, 1953, in Albany, Georgia. She grew up in a big family and had always wanted to help people. After finishing high school, she earned a medical degree and started working as a mental health and substance abuse counselor. Later on, Pamela went into private practice and opened her own office. Over the years, she continued helping people, and many of her clients deeply valued the role she played in their recovery. In 2002, at the age of 49, Pamela decided to move to a new city, Athens, also in Georgia. She wanted to expand her business and kept working after the move. At the time, Pamela wasn't married and didn't have children. Most of her life had been focused on her work, helping others, and supporting her family whenever she could. On August 21, 2002, residents of an apartment complex on the edge of town reported a strange smell coming from one of the buildings. Staff went to check it out and quickly traced the odor to Unit 408. No one answered the door, so they used a spare key to get inside. But the moment they opened the door, they were met with a horrifying scene, a body lying on the living room floor. So, they immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they found the body of a woman, but there were no documents anywhere in the apartment to say who she was. She was only wearing underwear, which led detectives to consider sexual assault as a possible motive. But one thing stood out. Someone had covered her with a sheet, which was quite odd. They also noticed there were no signs of forced entry at the front door. However, the balcony door had been left slightly open, leading detectives to believe the killer may have come in that way. While the medical examiners worked on the body, crime scene investigators searched the apartment for clues. The living room was covered in blood, but tests later showed it all belonged to the victim. Still, in the middle of that chaos, they found one critical piece of evidence, a single drop of someone else's blood on a newspaper sitting on the kitchen counter. Tests confirmed it came from a man, but there was no match in the DNA database. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been stabbed more than 20 times. She also had multiple defensive wounds, showing she fought back hard during the attack. However, there were no signs of sexual assault, ruling out the detectives' original theory. The first priority for police was to figure out who the victim was, so they went to speak with the building manager. To their surprise, he told them the apartment was rented by a man named Richard, who, as far as anyone knew, lived there alone. Detectives started trying to track him down, and before long, they managed to reach him by phone. Richard told them he'd been in Florida on a work trip for the past few weeks. He also identified the victim. It was Pamela Chrysler. According to him, they'd met not long ago and had gone on a date, but nothing romantic ever developed. Still, they stayed in touch as friends, and when Richard had to leave town, he offered to let Pamela stay at his place for free while he was gone. He said it made him feel better knowing someone was keeping an eye on the apartment. Richard also mentioned that they'd been talking on the phone every day, until 4 days ago when she suddenly stopped answering. He thought it was strange, but figured she was just busy and didn't think much of it. Right from their first conversation with Richard, detectives started picking up some red flags. For starters, the fact that he let a woman he barely knew live in his apartment struck them as odd. On top of that, during the phone call, Richard mentioned that Pamela used to sleep with the balcony door slightly open, a detail that made investigators raise their eyebrows. They hadn't shared that information publicly, but they already suspected the killer had come in through that very door. So, why did Richard bring up that specific detail out of nowhere? Shortly after speaking with the police, Richard headed back home. But on the way, he called the apartment manager and made a strange request. He asked him to cut out the section of carpet where the blood stain had been found. He claimed he wanted to take the sample to a lab himself for testing. The manager found that so bizarre, he immediately reported it to detectives. Once Richard returned home, police brought him in for questioning. And throughout the interview, he continued to act strangely. As for his out-of-town alibi, investigators weren't quick to accept it. According to the medical examiner, The body had been in the apartment for at least a few days, meaning Richard could have committed the murder and left town right after. Still, during the interview, Richard provided solid proof that he'd been in Florida well before the murder. He also gave detectives the names of coworkers and other people who could vouch for his whereabouts. After speaking with them, police confirmed that Richard had, in fact, been out of state, and it seemed highly unlikely that he could have pulled off the crime. On top of that, forensic experts compared his DNA to the drop of blood found on the newspaper. And it wasn't a match. So, despite all the odd behavior, detectives crossed Richard off their list of suspects and kept searching for new leads. Given Pamela's work with people struggling with mental health issues and addiction, detectives started to wonder if one of her clients might have attacked her. They began looking into each of them, but that line of investigation didn't go anywhere. Still, trying to figure out a motive, they also considered the possibility that it was a robbery gone wrong. Pamela's apartment was on the ground floor, and she often left her balcony door slightly open. That alone could have been enough to tempt a random thief into breaking in. They asked Richard to go through the apartment and let them know if anything valuable was missing. He took a careful look around and said that, as far as he could tell, everything was still there. The only thing unaccounted for was a large vacuum cleaner. To police, this was just another strange detail. Why would a killer go through the trouble of carrying off a bulky, relatively cheap vacuum cleaner while leaving everything else behind? Still, detectives decided to check local pawn shops, hoping the killer might have tried to sell it. And that theory paid off quickly. At one of the shops, officers found Richard's vacuum. But there was a catch. There were no surveillance cameras inside or outside the building. The only lead they had was the employee who'd been working that day. He remembered a young guy, probably around 20 years old, coming in with a vacuum. Unfortunately, that was as far as it went. Every attempt to track the man down led nowhere, and once again, detectives were left with nothing. A few days later, once Richard was cleared to return to his apartment, he started chatting with his neighbors. He asked if anyone had seen someone taking a vacuum out of his place before Pamela was killed. Police had already considered the possibility that the vacuum incident might have been unrelated, that it could have been stolen earlier, and Pamela just hadn't noticed. But then Richard heard something interesting. One of his neighbors said she'd had trouble sleeping the night of the murder. At some point, she heard a noise in the hallway and looked through her peephole. That's when she saw a young man, someone she didn't recognize, rolling a vacuum cleaner out of Richard's apartment. At first, she thought about opening the door to offer help. But just as she reached for the handle, something didn't feel right. She hesitated and stayed put. As she kept watching through the peephole, she happened to crack open a soda can she'd been holding the whole time. The sound was loud enough that the man froze and stared straight at her door. He stood there for a few seconds, then grabbed the vacuum, shut the door behind him, and disappeared. Detectives were surprised, if not a little frustrated, that the woman had waited weeks to share something so important. She insisted it had simply slipped her mind, and at the time, she hadn't even considered that the man might have been the killer. Now that they had her statement, police worked with her to create a composite sketch of the suspect. When they showed it to the pawn shop employee, he confirmed that the man in the sketch looked a lot like the person who'd brought in the vacuum. Detectives released the sketch to newspapers and TV stations, hoping someone would recognize the man, but no useful tips ever came in. They kept digging for any other leads that might help identify him, but nothing panned out. Eventually, the case went cold because detectives had nothing solid to work with. Over the years, the file was reopened multiple times, but every time, it led straight to a dead end. That's how things stayed for 15 years. Then, out of nowhere, the case took an unexpected turn. Detectives were notified that a new DNA profile had been added to the FBI's database, and it was a match to the drop of blood found at the crime scene. It belonged to a 30-year-old man named Abdus LaRoche. His name had never once come up in Pamela's case, but he had crossed paths with police before, though not as a suspect. When LaRoche was a child, his parents joined a religious cult run by a man named Dwight York. York was infamous for building a massive compound in Georgia for his followers, complete with an Egyptian-style pyramid and sphinx. He attracted hundreds of people there until several children, including LaRoche, came forward and accused him of serious crimes. On top of those allegations, York faced a long list of other charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, and tax fraud. In the end, he was sentenced to 135 years in prison. Years later, when LaRoche was 24, he admitted that his testimony had been made up. But that confession didn't lead to a retrial. As for LaRoche, he was never charged, since he'd been just a child when he gave that statement. What really surprised detectives was how LaRoche's DNA ended up in the system in the first place. He'd been arrested for selling bootleg movie DVDs and was given probation. Not long after, he was pulled over by a patrol officer who found a small bag of illegal substances on him. Since he was still on probation, LaRoche was arrested again, and this time, a DNA sample was taken. And as soon as it hit the database, detectives saw the match to Pamela's case. With this long-awaited lead, they started digging into LaRoche's past and were stunned to learn that, at the time of the murder, he had been living in the same apartment complex as Pamela, just in a different building. He was 16 years old back then, and detectives had never spoken to him. Looking deeper, they managed to track down his old high school yearbook and compared a photo of LaRoche as a teen to the composite sketch based on the neighbor's description. The resemblance was striking. Now that detectives had a DNA match, they brought LaRoche in for questioning. At first, they played it cool, telling him they were just following up with former residents of the complex who hadn't been interviewed back in 2002. They asked if he'd ever been inside the victim's apartment. And he said no. But then they told him about the DNA evidence, his blood that had been found at the scene. That's when LaRoche changed his story. He claimed that Pamela had once paid him $40 to take out some trash from her apartment. Detectives pointed out that this didn't explain how his blood ended up on the kitchen counter. So, he changed his story again, this time saying he'd found her body, panicked, and ran off. Not long after, he shifted the story yet again, now claiming that he and Pamela had actually been in a romantic relationship, even though she was 33 years older than him. Detectives knew LaRoche was just scrambling to avoid taking a fall, but with a DNA match, they didn't actually need a confession. Still, they had to follow proper procedure before making an arrest. They got a warrant to collect a fresh DNA sample and sent the swab to the lab for final confirmation. While they waited for the results, the case took another unexpected turn. LaRoche's own brother called the FBI tip line. He said that years ago, LaRoche had actually confessed to him that he was the one who killed Pamela. According to his brother, LaRoche had told him that he had broken into Pamela's apartment in the middle of the night, planning to steal something. But while he was inside, she woke up and caught him, so he grabbed a knife and attacked her. Now, detectives had more than just a DNA match. They had a statement from LaRoche's own brother. Once the lab officially confirmed the blood at the scene belonged to LaRoche, he was arrested and prosecutors began preparing for trial. LaRoche continued to insist he was innocent, and the prosecutor realized this case might not be as straightforward as it seemed. At the time of the murder, LaRoche was only 16, and the only physical evidence linking him to the scene was a single drop of blood. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no other physical evidence to back it up. So yeah, it was possible a jury might decide that just wasn't enough. So prosecutors offered LaRoche a deal. If he pled guilty to manslaughter and the theft of the vacuum, they'd take life in prison and the death penalty off the table. He agreed almost immediately, signed a confession, and was sentenced to 20 years behind bars. He'll be eligible for release in 2038, when he's 52. After that, he'll be under supervision for another 20 years. And if he commits even a minor offense, he'll be sent straight back to prison. Pamela's family was stunned when detectives told them about the arrest. For 15 years, they believed the case would never be solved, that they'd never know what really happened. But in the end, LaRoche, who had managed to slip through the cracks for so long, got caught over something as small as selling bootleg DVDs.